After the withdrawal of Israeli troops, residents returning to northern and western Gaza were left standing in disbelief, faces frozen, as they stared at what was once their home. For the first time in weeks, people cautiously stepped back into the neighborhoods of Sheikh Radwan, Al-Karama, and Beach Camp. What they saw was beyond words. Entire apartment blocks turned to dust, hundreds of homes erased from the earth, and what little remained of daily life, gone. Dozens of videos now flood social media, each one showing residents walking through heaps of concrete and twisted metal, recording what little is left of their streets, their homes, their memories. In one video that spread across the region, a man's trembling voice breaks through the silence. "This is as far as we can go. The army is still close. Look around us. They've destroyed everything." Some filmed the wreckage in stunned silence. Others joined hands with weary civil defense workers, digging with whatever tools they could find, searching for bodies still buried beneath the ruins. At least 8 bodies had been pulled from the rubble of northern Gaza. Despite running out of fuel, equipment, and strength, rescue teams kept searching, street after shattered street. Scenes like these have become all too familiar across Gaza. Districts once full of life, now silent, except for the sound of grief. In today's USMag audio story, we look deeper into what 2 relentless years of conflict have done to this land, years marked by destruction, loss, and the endless cycle of displacement that the people of Gaza continue to endure. This is USMag. According to the latest estimates from the United Nations, around 10% of Gaza's 2.1 million residents have been forced to leave their homes since the war began, a conflict now stretching into its 2nd year. Experts in war, displacement, and international law, alongside historians and academic researchers, say what's unfolding is extraordinary and deeply concerning. Because in a territory so small, so densely packed with people, the absence of safe places and the constant movement of civilians is something rarely seen in modern history. Today, ordinary families in Gaza find themselves trapped inside a strip of land under siege. Many have been told to move again and again, each time into areas already overcrowded, where food, water, and shelter are increasingly scarce. These repeated displacements have left entire towns, neighborhoods, and communities almost empty. The population of once bustling districts has shrunk dramatically. Experts say what's happening in Gaza today has no modern parallel. They describe it as a displacement crisis unlike anything the world has seen since the end of the Second World War. The borders of Gaza are now effectively sealed. There is nowhere to run and nowhere truly safe to stay. Over the past 2 years, Israel has issued repeated orders for civilians to evacuate certain zones, each announcement setting off another wave of desperate movement. Israeli officials say these are extraordinary measures, steps taken to protect civilians while striking Hamas targets. But human rights organizations see it differently. They say what's happening amounts to forced displacement, families pushed to leave not by choice, but by circumstance. According to a 2024 Danish Refugee Council study, the average family in Gaza has been displaced 6 times since the conflict began. Some families have been forced to flee as many as 19 times, moving again and again in search of safety that never lasts. In recent weeks, renewed military operations in Gaza City have forced hundreds of thousands more to flee once again, adding to an already overwhelming humanitarian crisis. At Oxford University, Professor Dan Chatty, an expert in displacement and migration, says that nothing in recent history compares to Gaza, not just because of the sheer numbers, but because of the conditions under which people are moving. He explains, in Gaza, there's nowhere left to go. People are escaping one dangerous place only to arrive in another. Throughout this conflict, Israel has relied on leaflets, text messages, and online warnings to tell civilians which areas to leave. Many of those warnings have directed people toward Al-Mawasi, a narrow, sandy coastal strip labeled by Israel as a safe zone. But on multiple occasions, that same safe zone has been hit by airstrikes. The Israeli Defense Forces say these evacuation notices are meant to protect civilians, guiding them along designated routes and corridors to safety. They insist their operations comply with international law. At the same time, Israel accuses Hamas of embedding its fighters among civilians and says that its strikes target militant activity, not the civilians themselves, nor the areas it has marked as safe. But on the ground, for Gaza's families, safety remains an illusion. Each new warning, each new move, is just another step in a cycle of displacement that feels without end. Mass displacement. Across Gaza, the signs of mass displacement are everywhere. Entire communities uprooted. Tents rising, falling, and rising again, as families move from one stretch of barren earth to another, searching desperately for somewhere, anywhere, that feels safe. On the outskirts of Hamad City, near Al-Mawasi, the landscape began to shift in May 2024. What was once an empty, dusty field, soon filled with rows upon rows of makeshift tents. Families gathered there after hearing it was part of a so-called safe zone. But by July, that empty land had vanished beneath a sea of canvas and tarps. Thousands of displaced people living shoulder to shoulder, trying to survive in the chaos of uncertainty. Yet even that fragile sense of refuge didn't last. The area was evacuated twice afterward, each time under Israeli military orders. Families cleared out, their shelters torn down or abandoned. And each time, when the area was later reclassified as a humanitarian zone, they returned, rebuilding their lives from scraps, only to lose them again. One of those mass evacuations came in August 2024, after the Israel Defense Forces claimed that militants were launching rockets nearby. Almost a year later, another order came. Another wave of panic. And once again, thousands were forced to pack up and walk away from what little they had left. Among those repeatedly displaced is Soha Musla, a nurse, a mother of 2 young children, and one of countless Gazans whose lives have become a cycle of flight and return. In the spring of 2024, Soha and her family passed through Hamad City while moving south toward Deir al-Balah, hoping for safety. She still remembers that journey. Sometimes, she says softly, you can only take your life with you, nothing else. And then, you have to start everything over again. Soha and her family have been displaced 8 times in total. 8 times, they've packed up what they could, joining endless streams of families, carrying children, the elderly, and a few scattered belongings. As new zones turned to targets, and new shelters became ruins. Her journey began in northern Gaza, after the October 7 Hamas attacks on Israel. Then came Khan Yunis, and eventually Rafah, the southernmost edge of the Strip, a place many believed would finally be safe. But even there, the ground assault began. For Soha and thousands like her, there has been no lasting refuge. Each move brings new uncertainty. Each return, new loss. In the first 4 months of the war, the 2 northern governorates of Gaza lost nearly 3/4 of their population. Homes, streets, schools emptied out. Entire neighborhoods turned into ghost towns. By early 2024, the southern city of Rafah had become the epicenter of refuge, hosting nearly 4 times its pre-war population. For a while, it was one of the few places people believed they could survive. But soon, even Rafah was declared unsafe. New evacuation orders came, and once more, people were told to leave. Today, Rafah lies in ruins, its streets shattered, its buildings flattened. Only a small fraction of its residents remain among the rubble. Most survivors have fled towards central Gaza, to areas like Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah. Together, these regions now hold nearly 3 times their original populations. The strain is unimaginable. Every field, every half-standing structure has become a temporary refuge for families with nowhere else to go. The once clear lines between cities and camps have now blurred into a single, overcrowded landscape of displacement and survival. This is the human cost of a war still unfolding. A story not of numbers, but of lives, moved, scattered, and remade, again and again. Engineered exodus. In Gaza, displacement has taken on a meaning unlike anywhere else in the world. Experts say this isn't a single wave of people fleeing a single war. It's a cycle, a relentless repeating process of movement, where civilians are trapped, under siege, and forced to flee again and again from one shattered street to the next. At the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Professor Daniel Blattman, a leading Holocaust scholar, says what's unfolding in Gaza has no parallel in modern times. This isn't just a war zone, he explains, it's a siege, and the displacement here is happening under lethal, inescapable conditions. Inside this sealed strip of land, ordinary families are told to move, again and again, into neighborhoods already packed beyond capacity. At the same university, international law expert Professor Yuval Shani calls the situation unprecedented. He says the vast majority of Gaza's civilians, men, women, and children, have been unable to escape the conflict zone entirely. He points out that both Israel and Hamas are conducting operations that continue to place civilians in danger, while the world remains largely silent, offering little pressure on Israel or Egypt to open their borders and allow safe passage for those desperate to leave. Across the ocean, in Florida, Professor Norman J.W. Goda, a historian of Holocaust and conflict studies, describes what's happening as one of the most severe examples of forced migration in decades. But he adds that without these evacuation orders, Israel might have struck Hamas positions without issuing any warnings to civilians, a move that could have caused even greater loss of life. He also reminds us that so-called safe zones can only exist when both sides in a war agree to respect them. Israel tried to create one such zone in al-Mawasi, he says, but Hamas continued to operate there, turning even that supposed refuge into another battleground. In recent months, over 80% of Gaza's territory has either come under Israeli military control or been emptied out after residents were ordered to leave. By July 2024, the United Nations reported that number had risen to nearly 88%. Entire districts have vanished beneath rubble and debris, shrinking what little livable space remains and pushing survivors into increasingly desperate conditions. Aid groups working with the UN Relief and Works Agency estimate that people now living in tents and temporary shelters have, on average, less than half a square meter of space per person. That's like 40 people crammed into a single 4 by 5 meter room. Even with community kitchens, water points, and field clinics still struggling to operate, humanitarian workers say they are overwhelmed. The demand for food, clean water, and medicine has grown faster than they can respond. Israel, meanwhile, faces accusations of blocking humanitarian supplies and restricting aid convoys from entering Gaza. The Israel Defense Forces deny this, insisting that they've increased deliveries of food, medicine, and shelter materials, and that southern Gaza's infrastructure has been prepared to support the expected population size. For many Palestinians, this moment feels painfully familiar. They see echoes of their past, a tragedy their grandparents called the Nakba, the catastrophe. Back in 1948, during the war that accompanied Israel's founding, around 750,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes. Many of Gaza's families today are descendants of those who were displaced 75 years ago. Among them is Hussam Zomlot, now head of the Palestinian Mission in the United Kingdom. He recalls, "We know exactly what happened in 1948. Once people were told to evacuate, they never returned. That was the Nakba, and it's happening again." Zomlot says Israel's military campaign is erasing what remains of Gaza, leaving those who fled with no homes, no cities, and no return. And his final words carry the weight of generations. "This isn't accidental. It's not chaos, it's displacement by design." In Gaza, home is no longer a place. It's a memory and a hope that one day the journey might end. Questions that need answers. Human Rights Watch and the United Nations Commission have both reached a chilling conclusion that Israel's actions in Gaza amount to genocide. Both organizations say that the scale and nature of forced displacement bear all the signs of a war crime. Amnesty International and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, they too have echoed the same grave assessment. According to a spokesperson for the UN Human Rights Office, these displacements rarely meet the strict conditions required for lawful evacuation. The reason, they explain, lies in the scale and frequency of evacuation orders that often have little to do with immediate military necessity or the protection of civilians. And as civilians flee, desperately seeking safety, they too become targets. Many international law experts now believe these mass movements of people cannot be seen as voluntary. They are, in their words, forced displacements, a direct violation of international law. But Israel rejects these accusations entirely. It insists it is not committing genocide nor engaging in war crimes. Officials say Israel takes extraordinary measures to reduce civilian harm. They claim the evacuations are temporary, done solely to protect lives, and that Israeli forces are operating under the strictest interpretation of international humanitarian law. Israel's position is clear. We have no intention of governing Gaza, they say. Our aim is not occupation, but defense. The military campaign began on October 7, 2023, after Hamas launched a deadly assault on southern Israel. That day, around 1,200 people were killed and 251 were taken hostage. In response, Israel began an extensive military operation in Gaza. According to Gaza's health authorities, over 66,000 people have been killed and more than 170,000 injured since the assault began. The United Nations estimates that nearly 92% of all homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed since that day. This figure, based on data from the local Ministry of Housing, reveals the near total devastation of an entire city. Among the displaced is Soha, a mother of two. She now lives in the central city of Nusayrat with her husband, her parents, and her siblings' families. All of them crammed into a single, ruined one-bedroom apartment once owned by a relative. Her voice, weary yet steady, carries the weight of survival. "We're living here, and somehow getting by," she says softly. Because no matter how hard it is, it's still better than living in a tent. In Gaza City and across the northern region, nearly 700,000 displaced people wait, not in comfort, but in uncertainty. They wait for the day the evacuation finally ends. They wait to go home. Among them is a school teacher, Ala Saleh. 3 weeks ago, he fled to Khan Yunis with his wife and 6 children. Now, with the coastal road open again, he says he's ready to return north, no matter what he finds there. His home was destroyed nearly a year ago. What remains is only rubble and dust. For months, he lived in a tent, pitched over the ruins of what once was his family home. "I'll go back," he says. "Even if it's only ruins, I'll put my tent there again." For Allah and for thousands like him, it isn't just about shelter, it's about belonging and rebuilding a sense of life amid the wreckage. "We only want to rebuild," he says softly. "We're tired of living in tents that protect us from nothing, neither from the heat of summer nor from the cold winds of winter." Their voices echo through the broken streets of Gaza, a chorus of endurance, a quiet promise to keep moving forward, even when everything else has fallen apart. These stories remind us, even in the darkest places, hope still whispers. This is Gaza's story, a journey through pain and the quiet courage to begin again. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share, and comment. For more real stories, subscribe to USMag.